On June the 2nd, 1978, Japan Airlines Flight 115 suffered an accident when coming into land at Osaka's Itami Airport. During the final approach to the runway, just as the plane was touching down, the pilot pitched the nose of the huge Boeing 747 up too steeply. This caused the tail of the plane to hit and scrape along the runway. Fortunately, the 747 was able to complete its landing on the runway successfully, and although the plane had suffered substantial damage to its rear end and some passengers had been injured, a major incident had been avoided. However, what seemed at the time to have been a lucky escape would go on to have terrible consequences. This botched landing would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to the deaths of 520 people on the slopes of a forested mountainside some 7 years later. The Boeing 747 in question had been built in 1974, a special version of the standard 747 that was specifically designed for Japan's crowded short-haul domestic routes. To us in the modern day, it might seem crazy using a super jumbo for short-hop domestic flights that weren't even an hour long, but the number of passengers flying between Japan's two largest cities, Tokyo and Osaka, necessitated the use of such huge planes. This was especially true during the Obon festival, when Japanese families would return to their ancestral homes to pay homage to their forefathers. So this plane was very much in demand, making numerous short-haul flights day in, day out, year in, year out. The accident during the landing at Osaka caused extensive and severe damage to the rear section of the fuselage, but being only 4 years old, the plane had lots of years of service left in it. So the decision was made to repair the plane and not to scrap it. Now, there's nothing untoward about this decision made by Japan Airlines. There's no reason why, with the correct repairs, this aircraft couldn't keep flying until the end of its service life. The problem was that someone made a crucial and ultimately fatal error when carrying out the repair work. Now, the tail strike had caused extensive damage to the tail section, but possibly the most difficult aspect of the repair work was the repair of the rear pressure bulkhead. This is the structural division between the pressurised part of the aircraft, that's where the passengers and the crew are, and the unpressurised rear section of the aircraft. On this plane, the bulkhead was shaped a bit like a half dome. It's like a shallow soup bowl that's been turned on its side. The whole thing was made from aluminium segments that were riveted together and reinforced with steel stiffeners. Now, during the landing at Osaka, the impact had crumpled to the lower part of this bulkhead, and for some reason the decision was made not to replace the entire thing, but instead just to replace the lower damaged half. However, when it came time to fit this new lower section of bulkhead, it became apparent that on one side the overlap was a bit narrow. There was only enough room to place one row of rivets where 2 rows were needed. So to solve this problem, the Boeing ground team that carried out the repairs used a splice plate in the middle, a third plate to which both sections of the bulkhead could be securely riveted. Now, it's at this point that a truly horrendous error was made. In order to fit the splice plate around the stiffener, the team cut the plate into 2, and they riveted 2 separate sections to the bulkhead instead of one continuous plate. The result was that the upper seam was, in effect, still only attached with 1 row of rivets that were taking all the strain. Now, this seemingly obvious error somehow went unnoticed. By the time the bulkhead repairs were inspected for approval, the whole area had been caulked in sealant and the flawed repair had been hidden from view. But the rear pressure bulkhead now had a hidden weak link. It was like a ticking time bomb, and if that weak seam ever failed during a flight, it would certainly end in catastrophe. Okay, so fast forward 7 years to August the 12th, 1985. And 3 days before the busy Obon festival, and the 747 is loaded with 509 passengers and 15 crew. 524 men, women and children, excited and ready to make the short flight from Tokyo's Haneda airport to Osaka. Now, during the intervening 7 years, this 747 has made over 12,000 of these short-haul flights. That means over 12,000 depressurizations and repressurizations, which have been slowly but surely weakening the row of single rivets in the rear bulkhead, weakening them to such a degree that many little hairline cracks are now visible in the splice plate. Little hairline cracks which haven't been picked up during the routine visual inspections that the plane underwent. So, you have the botched landing 7 years earlier, the flawed repair on the bulkhead, and the visual inspections which have failed to pick up the telltale signs of failure. And now the passengers and crew of Japan Airlines Flight 123 were about to pay the ultimate price for these mistakes. Captained by 49-year-old Masami Takahama and accompanied by First Officer Yutaka Sasaki and Flight Engineer Hiroshi Fukuda, Flight 123 took off just after 6 p.m. on August 12, 1985, looping over Tokyo Bay and heading out over the Gulf of Sagami, flying west towards Osaka. It's just another short hop, regular flight between the two cities with nothing seemingly out of the ordinary. But 12 minutes into the flight, as the airliner was passing above Oshima Island at an altitude of around 24,000 feet, the rear pressure bulkhead failed and Flight 123 suffered a catastrophic decompression event. In the space of just a few thousandths of a second, the rivets on the weakened seam ripped apart and a massive wave of pressurized air blew the bulkhead apart like a blown out tyre. The effect was like a small bomb going off in the tail section as the pressure wave tore through the tail cone, destroying it and blasting shrapnel in all directions, severing hydraulic control lines in the process. The pressure wave literally ripped the huge tail fin to pieces. The pieces then disintegrated and tore off completely. Inside the cabin, passengers heard a loud bang and the air suddenly filled with white mist as the moisture in the cabin air condensed. Napkins, newspapers, magazines, they all rushed through the air towards the rear of the plane as the cabin depressurized. The roof of the rear passenger toilet block caved in and daylight could be seen through a large crack in the rear fuselage. One can only imagine the terror and panic on board as the air masks dropped from above and the huge aircraft began swaying and bucking in a sickening and violent motion. In the cockpit, the flight crew had no idea of what had happened, but they definitely felt the explosion and they heard the bang. Captain Takahama requested an emergency return to Haneda Airport, which was granted, but he quickly realised that they were in dire straits, as First Officer Sasaki cried out that the 747 was not responding to his inputs, and Flight Engineer Hiroshi Fukuda confirmed that they'd lost all hydraulic pressure. The awful truth was that the flight crew were no longer in control of the aircraft. The blast had severed most of the hydraulic lines in the rear of the plane, meaning that as well as having no rear rudder or tail fin, the remaining control surfaces were now no longer operational. The pilots only had control of the engine thrust. They couldn't turn or control the pitch of the aircraft. Despite the damage, the plane remained airborne. It began to enter a sea-sickening roller coaster ride of ups and downs, while simultaneously swaying left and right, as it wove its way north towards Mount Fuji and the hilly inland area of Honshu Island. This horrible, nightmarish rise and plunge must have caused terror beyond belief for the passengers, who by now must have been aware that the plane was completely out of control, with little to no hope of making a landing, and yet they remained airborne, zigzagging and lurching through the sky above the mountains of Japan. After about 15 minutes of this horrible motion, the 747 did a full 360-degree spiral, pitching down, losing about 8,000 feet of altitude just south of Mount Fuji. Terrified passengers would have seen the mountain looming just below them, the plane seemingly heading straight for it before coming out of the loop and then seesawing northwards again. Witnesses on the ground could see the plane swaying and lurching, obviously in distress, and somebody managed to snap a blurry picture of the doomed jet, clearly showing the missing tail fin as the giant plane staggered on through the sky. In the cockpit, it was a lose-lose scenario for the flight crew. If they tried to dampen the roller coaster ups and downs by alternating the engine thrust, it exacerbated the swaying motion, and vice versa. Captain Takahama and First Officer Sasaki had little to no options left open to them. All they could do was try to use what limited control they had left to keep the crippled behemoth airborne for as long as possible. Terrified, possibly suffering from lack of oxygen, the flight recorder indicates that none of them tried to put on their oxygen masks, the men struggled heroically with everything they had to try and get back on course to the airport. But any and all efforts were to be in vain. 32 minutes after the bulkhead failure, the doomed airliner, which had now dropped to 5,400 foot of altitude, clipped the top of a forest ridgeline, flipped upside down, and pancaked into the opposite slope 500 metres away on the other side of the valley. Captain Takahama screamed, "It's the end," just before the doomed airliner struck the hillside and exploded in a huge fireball. With debris and fire spread out on the mountain, it wasn't long before the first aircraft made a pass over the crash site. The United States C-130 altered course, and just 25 minutes after the crash, that's around 7:20 p.m, located and reported the coordinates to the Japanese authorities. A nearby US airbase offered a chopper and crew to go straight to the site and do a reconnoitre, but the Japanese authorities refused the offer. At this point, things take another tragic turn. Upon hearing of the complete devastation at the crash site, and possibly influenced by one of the C-130 crew who said over the radio, "I doubt there'll be any survivors," the Japanese authorities decided to muster all recovery teams in the village of Ueno, which was the closest village to the crash site, but then told them all to wait and to set out at first light. The terrain was steep and difficult, and assuming there were no survivors, it seemed to make sense to wait until daybreak to begin the recovery operation. During the night, helicopters flew over the crash site, now plainly visible as it burned in the darkness. What no one knew at the time was that they were in fact survivors, many of whom had died during the night as the rescue teams assembled and waited in the valley below. The Japanese government had assembled hundreds of rescue vehicles, thousands of firemen, rescue workers and policemen. Also available were helicopters and spotter planes. But the first people to actually reach the crash site were about 160 rescuers who had trekked up the valley from Ueno village, setting off at dawn and arriving at about 10 in the morning. It was like a vision of hell. The fires were still burning, bodies and twisted debris littered the hillside. There wasn't much there that resembled any part of an aircraft, the impact had been so severe. Making a search of the impact zone, the rescuers realised that as the aircraft smashed into the slope, the end part of the tail section had sheared off and had tumbled down into the adjacent valley bottom. And it was here that, amazingly, they found 26-year-old Yumi Ochiai, badly wounded and trapped, but still alive, some 16 hours after impact. Nearby, hanging from the branches of a tree, was 12-year-old Keiko Kawakami, and she was also alive. Rescuers soon found 30-year-old Hiroko Yoshizaki and her 8-year-old daughter Mikiko, wounded but again alive. Hope surged as the rescue team frantically searched the remains of the tail section, but that was it. 4 survivors. Just 4 people out of the 524 that were on board. The aftermath of the crash of Flight 123 was marked by shock, grief and sorrow in Japan and around the world. There's something particularly horrible and chilling to me about the fact that it stayed airborne for so long. That horrible, out-of-control motion must have made most passengers aware that the plane was completely out of control, that there's going to be no emergency landing, there's no chance of avoiding a crash. And can you imagine what that must have been like, being on there with your family? It's the stuff of nightmares. Many of the passengers, aware of the dire situation that they were in, they wrote goodbyes to their relatives on napkins, bits of paper, in notebooks, scribbling saddening, tragic last words to be read by loved ones after they'd died. These were just ordinary people, knew that they were living their final moments on board that horrible, doomed aircraft. One of the 4 survivors, Ryoichi, described the moment of the crash during an interview from a hospital bed. There were 2 or 3 strong shocks. Sheets, cushions and other objects around me flew into the air. Seats fell on top of me and I couldn't move. My stomach hurt so bad it felt like I was going to be torn to pieces. I was pinned between seats and I couldn't move. I saw a helicopter and I waved, but it didn't appear to see me. Now, she also stated that there had been many other people in the tail section who did indeed survive the initial impact. She said she heard panting and gasping noises from many people, and she heard other survivors talking to one another and a young boy trying to find his mother. However, by dawn the next day, all these survivors were dead. They'd succumbed to their injuries after spending the night on the mountainside without any aid or shelter. Incredibly, the official report into this disaster makes no mention of this eyewitness testimony, instead declaring that all 520 victims of Flight 123 perished at the instant of impact. Not surprisingly, this finding proved contentious, with many relatives of the victims crying foul at this seemingly blatant cover-up of the authorities of their mistake of waiting for up to 12 hours before setting out for the crash site. In fact, the whole investigation seemed bogged down in bureaucracy and infighting, with air crash investigators being kept away from the scene by local police who, unbelievably, initially insisted on taking charge. It took a month of inter-agency wrangling just to get the wreckage removed from the mountainside. The 332-page report into the crash of Japanese Airlines 123 also failed to answer the most pertinent question of all. Why had the repair to the pressure bulkhead been so badly fudged? The report just skipped this question, leaving many people unable to get a satisfactory answer as to the question of exactly who was to blame. Was it Boeing, or was it actually more the failure of Japan Airlines? To this day, nobody really knows for sure the exact role each party had to play in the disaster. In the wake of the tragedy, some at Japan Airlines certainly blamed themselves. The CEO resigned, and 2 senior maintenance workers committed suicide in order to repent for the mistakes made by the company. If you add them to the death toll, it gives 522. It was, and remains to this day, the worst single aircraft disaster in history. And just a couple of points in closing. Firstly, some of you might be thinking that this all sounds very familiar. If so, you might be thinking of the crash of the Turkish DC-10 outside of Paris back in 1974, where explosive decompression cut through the control cables in the tail of the plane, and that caused the death of all 346 people on board. One of the takeaways from that disaster was the need for a pressure release door in the tail to avoid exactly this scenario of the total loss of control due to the control lines being severed. Well, the 747 had one of these doors, but whether it malfunctioned or whether it was sealed shut, nobody knows. No answer has ever been given as to why this failsafe didn't work. And secondly, several experienced aircrews have recreated this scenario in flight simulators to see if there was any possible way that the crew of Flight 123 could have landed the plane. Even in just simulation conditions, without being terrified out of your mind and being oxygen starved, none of them have ever managed to land Flight 123 successfully. In fact, many crews have expressed only the deepest admiration for Captain Takahama, Officer Sasaki, and Engineer Fukuda for being able to stay airborne for as long as they did. Ultimately, anything the crew tried could only delay the inevitable. Flight 123 was doomed from the second that the bulkhead ruptured, and there was nothing anyone could do to change that fact.